Over the last 3 days, our government have made a few what seem like hasty announcements. First, rolling out a test and trace system before the computer system was ready, and now loosening the lockdown, even though their own scientific advice suggests that might not be the best idea. Have they given up any pretense whatsoever of following the science? And perhaps more importantly, are these announcements coming purely to take Dominic Cummings away from the daily headlines? To discuss that story, I'm joined by Aaron Bastani. How are you doing?
I'm good, Michael. I'm a bit hot and sweaty. I'm just on a cross trainer.
Very impressive.
Did a spot of
you
hoovering.
Have a cross trainer in your house?
We bought one secondhand for £120 before lockdown. And I fixed it, cleaned it up. It's one of the ones you get in the gyms. It's like a Life Fitness one. So normally it'd be like £1,000. And this guy didn't think it worked, and it works great. I mean, one side you sort of go half an inch. It's not perfectly symmetrical. We need to get that sorted. I need to get some tools after lockdown. But yeah, we're good. So I've been doing that every day.
That's quite a lot of cleaning. You got the exercise equipment before the moment of scarcity started.
The day before.
On tonight's show, we're going to talk about that, whether the government have stopped even bothering to pretend they're following the science. First, though, we're going to talk about Rishi Sunak's latest announcement about the tapering off of the furlough scheme. And for the final part of the show, we'll be joined by US-based human rights activist Tia Oso to discuss the protests in Minneapolis against the killing of George Floyd. And what was an incredible piece of footage, which many of you will have seen today, of a CNN reporter getting arrested live on air. Completely extraordinary. Before we get on to that first story, share the link, tweet your comments on the hashtag TiskiSour. So Rishi Sunak today announced how the furlough scheme would work over the coming months. That principally involves employers contributing a little bit more to pay for their employees. Let's take a look at that announcement from a couple of hours ago.
I believe it is right, in the final phase of this 8-month scheme, to ask employers to contribute alongside the taxpayer towards the wages of their staff. But I understand too that businesses and employers have been through an incredibly difficult time. So I have decided to ask employers to pay only a modest contribution, introduced slowly over the coming months. In June and July, the scheme will continue as before, with no employer contribution at all. In August, the taxpayer contribution to people's wages will stay at 80%. Employers will only be asked to pay national insurance and employer pension contributions, which, for the average claim, account for just 5% of total employment costs. By September, employers will have had the opportunity to make any necessary changes to their workplaces and business practices. Only then, in the final 2 months of this 8-month scheme, will we ask employers to start paying towards people's wages. In September, taxpayers will pay 70% of the furlough grant, with employers contributing 10%. In October, taxpayers will pay 60% and employers will contribute 20%. Then, after 8 months of this extraordinary intervention, of the government stepping in to help pay people's wages, the scheme will close.
So that was Rishi Sunak delivering, I think, what was a kind of more generous announcement, actually, than what many people were expecting. This has become a bit of a habit of Rishi Sunak to get people to brief something which worries people and then announce something which seems more generous than what they were expecting. So people were worried that if he forced employers to start paying large proportions of people's furlough wages in August, then you would get high levels of unemployment. He said, actually, in August, they'll only have to pay national insurance and pension contributions. Actually, let's get up a graphic with this detail. So in August, employers will pay national insurance and pension contributions. In September, employers will contribute 10% of wages. And in October, they'll contribute 20% of wages. Employees, if they can stay on the furlough scheme, will get 80% of their salary the whole time. There was also an announcement for the self-employed support scheme. That's going to be extended for another 3 months, though down from 80% of one's average 3-month income to 70%. Aaron, I'll go to you. Rishi Sunak has developed quite a skill at exceeding expectations here, hasn't he? There was, people saying he's going to announce something which is going to crash the economy in August and people are going to get thrown on the dole. It doesn't look like that's what's happened in the end.
No, I mean, it compounds something we've repeatedly said, which is that the furlough scheme has been the most effective feature of the government's intervention since early March. The public health intervention's been terrible. The longer-term industrial strategy stuff's been terrible. The communication's been terrible. Basic adherence to things has been terrible, i.e. Dominic Cummings. But the sort of interim employment / industrial strategy around specifically coronavirus with Rishi Sunak, I mean, he comes out this smelling of roses. There's a reason why he's the #1 polling politician in the UK right now. People say, oh, well, Starmer's catching up with Johnson. Yeah, Rishi Sunak's about 30 points, higher still. And whether or not that's intentional, this over-promising, I mean, it's really impressive. He's got Allegra Stratton, former BBC Newsnight journalist, working, I believe, with him now. She might be part of that. But if there's a contender right now looking to replace Boris Johnson either before or after the next general election, or even, I presume Johnson would prefer far after the next general election, it would be Rishi Sunak. He looks really, really impressive. He's coming out of the smelling of roses. And that's what Labour activists and people on the left and our viewers have to think about. Starmer might perform better than Boris Johnson. I think you probably, on the basis of coronavirus, you have to presume that Boris Johnson is a busted flush. He might not be. But a crisis of this scale would hamper or undermine any prime minister, left, right, good, bad. So I think keeping an eye on Sunak and his popularity and what he's doing and his consistency in intervening is really important.
I mean, I think one thing that's notable about Sunak's announcements when they come is that he seems happy spending a lot of money. So the briefings that you get before the big announcements are that to save money, they're going to have to, lower the amount that employees get. Or to save money, they're going to have to increase quite dramatically the amount that employers provide. And then each time he's like, oh, actually, no, the state is happy to take the burden here. We'll continue paying that money, which seems rare compared to previous Tory chancellors, George Osborne most obviously. But there are still some significant problems with what he has announced. And it's basically because of who falls through the cracks. So I think the Tories have got really a great populist offer in a way because it works for most workers. If you're on a steady, good salary and coronavirus has disrupted your life, then it's quite likely that Sunak is I don't like the phrase subsidizing, but Sunak has managed to put together a support package, which means that you can survive coronavirus quite comfortably.
Well, can I say he probably is? Yeah. There's a lot of people. He is. We know, for instance, personal savings right now for a lot of the population are going through the roof because, like you say, 70% of people are doing quite well out of this, and actually they come out of this looking at a net positive 60-70%.
The people who aren't doing well, though, and it's a significant minority, people without stable employment. So if you didn't have a permanent contract and you can't get furloughed and you don't have a record of self-employment contributions, you're stuck on universal credit, and we all know how stingy that is, even though they have raised it slightly. Self-employed people are going to be supported only until August. So if we don't see the economy back and moving properly, if we don't see various sectors open, then it's going to be a real problem for many self-employed people. Complaints, it's not sector specific. So people in hospitality are saying even though employers are only expected to pay 10%, then 20% if you're in an industry with no income whatsoever, so various pubs or restaurants, that's still going to be difficult. But the main problem for me, and this is what I think is the biggest problem, is that the access to the furlough scheme, even if you do have regular employment, is completely subject to the whim of your employer. So if you're desperate to be on the furlough, potentially because you're in a vulnerable category or because you live with someone who's in a vulnerable category, then you can ask for your employer to put you on the furlough scheme, but they're not forced to. And this is a real problem, especially for people who are in that clinically extremely vulnerable group. So the people who are shielded. So that's people with, for example, cystic fibrosis, extreme asthma, or who've had just an organ transplant, so they're on immunosuppressants. And this problem was highlighted in new research from Citizens Advice. Let's get this up. I'll go through it quite quickly. So 4 in 10, 41% of those in the shielded group have lost at least 20% of their income since the coronavirus outbreak began. More than a quarter, 27%, have lost 60% of their income or more. The charity has supported thousands of workers with underlying health conditions and their family members who have been denied access to the furlough scheme. Others were initially furloughed but have since been asked to return to frontline roles as shop workers and delivery drivers. Worryingly, as many as 1 in 10, 12% in the shielded group, are working outside of the home, despite this potentially putting their health at risk. And the reason why this is so outrageous, one, because it wouldn't cost that much to provide properly for people who are in that clinically extremely vulnerable category. But also the current strategy which the government are adopting, which is to loosen the lockdown, to allow people to go to barbecues, but also encourage them to go to work before the virus is properly suppressed in society. That might be a risk worth taking, or that, on the balance of costs and benefits for people who don't have underlying health conditions. That might seem like a fine risk to take. The people who really bear the cost for that policy, for not going for the South Korea model of properly suppressing it, are people who are in this clinically vulnerable category, because the longer we have the virus out in society, the longer they have to stay in their homes. And so on the surface, this is an argument to go for a completely different strategy, to go for the South Korea strategy, which is to suppress the virus. But the government have decided that's too costly, that's too expensive. So if you're going to choose the one that we've gone for, which is this sort of middle ground, sort of we'll start to loosen the lockdown while there's still a bit of virus around, the least you can do is compensate the real losers of that policy. And the real losers of that policy are people for whom catching coronavirus is a huge life-risking risk. Or it could risk your life, sorry. And as opposed to compensating them, we're actually basically punishing them for not being able to leave their homes. And I just think a lot has been said about how coronavirus has made us into a more caring, considerate society where, there's more solidarity around. And I think the way that people who are in these shielded categories, or people who are in vulnerable groups but not quite shielded, the way they have been abandoned, actually, basically, by the government. Whenever Boris Johnson is asked a question by someone about shielding, he says, we'll make sure everyone is looked after. But they haven't announced anything to look after these people. And Rishi Sunak's announcement today doesn't fill any of those cracks, doesn't make sure that people who were marginalized by existing systems aren't marginalized by this one now. Aaron.
Yeah, and it's the same with, for instance, sort of landlord rent suspensions. We're sure they'll do it. Most landlords are nice. It's in their interest as well. And it's very voluntaristic. We're spending more on the furlough scheme, 100 billion, it looks like now. That's the number that's being touted. We'll probably spend more on the furlough scheme over 8 months than we spend on the NHS over a year. Now, I know you don't like that comparison, Michael, because it makes it look like a zero-sum game. And obviously, when the state spends money, it gets some of it back through tax as a multiplier effect. The people spend the money they're given and so on. But it's a huge intervention. So for 100 billion, like you say, that there shouldn't be people falling through the cracks. We're spending a heck of a lot of money here. So there shouldn't be 20% of people coming out of this the other way, looking in really, really bad shape. And another thing about the furlough scheme, and I've heard this a couple of times, is people have been laid off when they could have just gone on the furlough scheme. And private businesses, their bosses, either they weren't aware they could go on furlough, or I don't, it's not quite clear to me. But there were people who were made unemployed or weren't furloughed but had their hours reduced and had to keep going to work. And you just think, what's going on here? Is this a communications issue, or I don't know. So I think in many ways, nobody chose to do it in the end, but it would have been interesting to see one country go with some form of UBI and a comparison in terms of effectiveness, in terms of how long social distancing might endure. People have done a great job for 3 months. Will that carry on? We don't know. And also a really worrying thing is this all kind of finishes in October, which is exactly when any second spike could really kick in. I mean, some people apparently, it's being alleged that could happen in July. That's doing the rounds in, online. People are talking about it everywhere, but London could see a second spike in July. But the government's been talking for a very long time about this being a particularly big issue next winter. And that's exactly when the furlough scheme is running down. And we would have spent 100 billion and we'll be going into that basically with no clothes, not prepared. What's the government scheme if we have a second spike in November and we have to shut down the economy again? Now, I'm not throwing that as an accusation. They clearly have to be thinking about it. They clearly have to model for that possibility because all the big issues and challenges so far, they've been very much unforeseen. And to an extent, that's understandable that they couldn't foresee, for instance, coronavirus in many ways. They should have been alive to things maybe a month, 6 weeks earlier, but nobody on January the 1st thought coronavirus would be doing what it's doing right now in the UK. we do have the gift of foresight when it comes to, well, where are we going to be in November, December? And that's a bit concerning, because that's not a conversation at all. Oh, great, the furlough scheme goes all the way through to October. Yeah, that's kind of the worst time for it to be going. I'm not saying it should go on indefinitely, but it's time now for journalists to be raising that conversation with the Tory party and the Labour Party too. You know, we're not going to get anywhere with that conversation if the Labour Party aren't there. You can't just take a back seat on this, because Keir Starmer and the shadow cabinet came in. They could do that in a sense because the government strategy responding to coronavirus had already been established. They won't have that gift if there is a second spike. They will have to come out propositionally saying you should be doing this instead of this. This kind of backseat driver approach won't work then.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think the reason why you do need Labour to come out here is because if you look at who the Tory party have included in their schemes and who they have excluded, the people who they have excluded are the people who they probably consider after the last 10 years to be least likely to vote for the Conservative Party. So if you were made unemployed at the start of this crisis, which was, you know, predominantly younger people in insecure jobs, then the support for you is pretty paltry, right? But they're thinking they're not going to vote Conservative anyway. If you're someone who's disabled, got underlying health conditions, someone who is usually reliant on the NHS, the Conservatives know you're not likely to vote Conservative anyway. So these are basically the marginalised, right? And it is people who were already marginalised who are being further marginalised by the Conservative policies, which, you know, are quite decent for insiders. And we have, you know, given them credit for the furlough scheme, which has been generous in many ways. But they have really abandoned people who don't fit into those particular categories, I think, because they don't see them as potential Conservative voters, which means that it is really, really incumbent upon the Labour Party to be shouting quite loudly about this. Because also, I mean, it's a bit cynical to look at it like this, but these aren't unpopular groups of people. You know, the idea that shielded people should have full financial support, almost compensation, to keep staying in their homes for months on end while everyone else is going to have barbecues. That's a very easy moral argument to make. And all progressives should be making it right now. There's no reason not to. But I'm not hearing it very often at all. So I find very surprising. We're going to go on to our next story. Before we do that, make sure you share the stream, like the video. We'll go on to it. Boris Johnson is gagging the scientists. So from Monday, the lockdown is being significantly eased, but it's unclear whether there is any science to back up the move. So before we go through the argument, let's take a look at Boris Johnson announcing changes at Thursday's Daily Downing Street press briefing.
Lastly, I know the toll that lockdown has taken on families and friends who've been unable to see each other. So from Monday, we will allow up to 6 people to meet outside, provided those from different households continue strictly to observe social distancing rules by staying 2 meters apart. At the moment, as you know, people can meet in parks, but not in private gardens. And this was a cautious first step. But we know that there is no difference in the health risk. So we will now allow people to meet in gardens and other private outdoor spaces.
So that wasn't all the changes that were announced. Let's get those up now. It takes a while to get these points across. So from Monday, groups of up to 6 people can meet outside, including parks, but also now gardens. That's what's been added. Schools will reopen for reception year 1 and year 6, and outdoor retail and car showrooms will open from the 15th of June. That's 2 weeks' time. Some face-to-face contact for years 10 and 12, and other non-essential retail to open. So a significant loosening of the lockdown there. I mean, I'm certainly going to be enjoying going out and sitting in groups of 6 people in a park. And there's no point in pretending that's not a good thing. But the problem, and there is a big problem for the government here, which is this moment for loosening the lockdown, for taking significant steps to increase the amount that we come into contact with each other, it goes completely against the advice which the government set for themselves. So it goes against the criteria which the government set for loosening the lockdown. Let's take a look at the COVID alert levels, which were introduced by the government. These are on the government's website, and it was introduced in that speech, now infamous, about 3 weeks ago, where Boris Johnson spoke to the nation and said, we've got to stay alert, and was very ambiguous about what is and what isn't opening. Can we get up this graphic now? So then Boris Johnson said, we're on level 4. That is when a COVID-19 epidemic is in general circulation, transmission is high or rising exponentially. And the action then is the current social distancing measures and restrictions. So that was the social distancing measures that were in place 3 weeks ago and up to now. Now, what Boris Johnson said then is that for us to go to the next phase, we'll have to go down to level 3. That's when the COVID-19 epidemic is in general circulation, but the transmission is not high. And that is when we'll have the gradual relaxing of restrictions and social distancing measures. Now, what we're getting at the moment is gradual relaxing of restrictions and social distancing measures. So you might expect we're at level 3, the lemon and herb level, as Ash calls it. And that is what also Boris Johnson suggested when he was speaking to the Parliamentary Liaison Committee earlier this week. So on Wednesday, Boris Johnson said, we're coming down the COVID alert system. We're coming down from level 3 to level 4, we hope. We're taking a decision tomorrow. So given that the lockdown, it was announced the lockdown would be easing yesterday, we would imagine that the scientists decided that, yes, we must have got to alert level 3. However, that didn't happen. So at the Downing Street Daily Briefing, this was at the press conference, or the one for journalists, not the one that gets streamed on TV. Sam Coates from Sky tweeted this. So Downing Street Daily Briefing, government was unable to reduce coronavirus threat level below 4. Boris Johnson signalled on Wednesday it was likely to be reduced to 3, but the Joint Biosecurity Unit did not agree to this yesterday. Lockdown lifting goes ahead nevertheless. So it's important to know, right? This idea of these 5 alert levels, this isn't something that independent SAGE came up with, or some group of people who were separate from the government and potentially critical of them. This was published by the government. The government told us they're setting up this biosecurity unit precisely so that when we get to the next phase of our COVID-19 response, it will be science-led, not politically led. Yeah. That's why they invented those categories. They've gone to that biosecurity unit and said, can we, are we ready to go down to alert level 3? They've said no, and they've said, oh, well, fuck it, we'll loosen the lockdown anyway, right? I mean, and journalists asked about this at today's daily press conference, and no one could answer the question. They just kept changing the subject. I mean, it's a bit like when they announced that R was the most important thing. Then they had a press conference. They had a whole video explaining the concept of R. Then they had to announce that R had risen a bit, and then the scientist has to stand up there. I think it was Jenny Harris that time, saying, "Oh, actually, R. R. Who cares about R? It's just one of many things we have to keep an eye on." So they keep failing their own tests.
Well, this table is only less than a month old. It's not like it's 6 months old and you go, okay, well, they're a bit embarrassed. That was an approach they don't really want to. First of all, nobody asked for this table. It wasn't like a demand. You have to do this. It was something that they, completely unprompted, said, we want to be judged by this less than a month ago. And so either that or the moves taken today, the measures taken today, announced today, something's being led here by media strategy rather than public health strategy, right? Hey, maybe even both, probably. And you're right. And you're saying, oh, the politics are coming before the science. I wouldn't even say the politics are coming before the science. I just think whatever the Downing Street press operations head has sort of, vomited that day, brain farted that day, generally seems to be informing these things. I mean, the table just makes, and also when that was published 3 weeks ago, I said, why would you do that? Why would you create these incredibly arbitrary categories? We might be doing really well on one thing, but not so well on something else. And why wouldn't you give yourself more room to maneuver? And I think at the time that was created purely as a kind of, we're doing something because the shit was really hitting the fan. 3 weeks ago, things were still looking. I mean, things are still looking terrible. I think ultimately we're going to have a second spike, and the government's going to continue to fail on all of this. And that remains to be seen. I hope that's not the case. But I think that was very much a kind of a PR stunt. I don't think it was ever actually something the government wished to be measured by. And the fact, like you said, it's happening today, I think that kind of confirms that.
Well, I mean, it might make sense to have an independent joint biosecurity unit, which is separate from the policymakers, to advise you whether or not we are in a situation to loosen the lockdown. The problem is they created it and now they're ignoring it. Well, it was modeled on a key part of their announcement.
No. Well, it was modeled on the kind of terrorist alerts after the 7/7 bombings, right? So you had color coding, etc., quite similar sort of categorization. So I always thought it was more public relations led, the sort of similarities it had to the sort of terror alert levels. Remember them? It was sort of, it was echoing through every government press conference and news program for about 6 months a year after 2005, 2006, 2007, all the way, well, up to 7 basically, for about a couple of years. But yeah, I never really had faith in it, Michael. So, but I'm glad you did. I'm glad somebody did.
I like to give him the benefit of the doubt, but I just keep getting disappointed. We're also going to go now to a worrying quote from Professor John Edmonds. So he is one of really the 2 top modelers who are advising SAGE. So along with Neil Ferguson, he's at the London School of Medicine and Tropical Hygiene. We've actually mocked him a couple of times on the show because he was the person who went on Channel 4 News arguing for herd immunity and then went on Channel 4 News 6 weeks later denying that herd immunity was, could even conceivably be a strategy, saying it doesn't even make sense to talk about that as a strategy. But in this case, he's still on SAGE, he's still a top modeler, and he is independent from the government, even if he tied himself in knots before. But this is what he said today. This was a briefing to journalists at the Science Media Centre. We can get up this quote. I think many of us would prefer to see the incidents driven down to lower levels because that would mean we have fewer cases occurring before we relax the measures. If we had incidents at a lower level, even if the reproduction level went up a bit, we wouldn't be in a position where we were overwhelming the health service. Next section. So I think at the moment with relatively high incidence, relaxing the measures and with an untested track and trace system, I think we are taking some serious risks here. Even if that risk doesn't play out and we keep the incidence flat, we're keeping it flat at quite a high level. All right. So this is one of the top modelers sitting on SAGE. We've got a government which is supposed to be following the science. Maybe they have just given up on that. Maybe now, if you ask them, are you following the science? It's like, fuck no, we never were in the first place. Anyway, let's abandon that pretense. But I haven't heard them say that yet. Yet they are breaking their own rules, breaking their own recommendations in terms of loosening it while they're still on alert level 4. And now the top modeler on SAGE, now that Neil Ferguson's gone, is saying he'd prefer the levels of COVID-19, because I think the ONS are predicting that there's still 9,000 people getting infected a day, would be much lower before we start loosening these social distancing measures. And the government are presumably completely ignoring this guy. I don't know if SAGE have had any input in terms of the loosening of the lockdown at this point in time.
Has anybody asked that question? That's a really good question, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I'm not sure if SAGE have had much input.
Well, it feeds into
seem like it.
It seems, the whole we're flattening the curve. Remember the government was saying we're flattening the curve at 1,000 deaths per day. You go, that's not an accomplishment. We're flattening the curve at a really high level. We're ending lockdown with still significant numbers of people dying, and like you say, the R rate being really high. It seems we're skeptics. We're not the Tories fans the best of times, but I think even to a supporter of the Conservatives, this seems probably quite injudicious. Seems like a huge risk. It seems a risk on a scale that could bring down the government. If it goes very badly wrong, it's unclear to me how the government, well, not necessarily the government, but the Prime Minister. It seems very unclear to me how the Prime Minister could then respond if we get a second spike. If we ever go back to 1,000 deaths a day this year, I really struggle to see how you'd have a Prime Minister that stays on. People were saying in the comments, Jacinda Ardern came out of this really well. Firstly, completely different political system. People said, oh, we could have had Corbyn was like Jacinda Ardern. Well, guess what? They both came second in a general election. Her party came second. They just have a proportional representation system. And also, New Zealand is literally the most.
I think they're above 50% now, though. They are.
Oh yeah, she's done phenomenally well. But they're also the most geographically isolated country in the OECD, right? You can't compare New Zealand to France or Britain. You can't. It's silly. Or the Netherlands.
Germany, you can.
Of course you can. No, but I'm saying
Germany is who we should be comparing ourselves to.
Absolutely. There you go. There's the social sciences coming out. But when people say, New Zealand, I think there's a few measures there that we have to take up with a pinch of salt.
Yeah. Let's go to a comment. Barnaby Catterell with a super chat, $31 Canadian. Thank you very much. Loving the show. My best friend Pedro got me into the show and now I'm hooked. It's his birthday today, so would you mind wishing him a happy birthday? He's a huge fan and it will definitely make his day. Happy birthday, Pedro. And thank you for recommending the show to your friends. That is a very good example to be setting for everyone watching this show. As you know, we want to get more people watching this every week to get these kind of messages out. Let's go on to our next story. So one hypothesis as to why the government are now more openly ignoring the science than they were before, even if they were doing it just more subtly before, is that now they are defending a position which is so nonsensical they cannot persuade a single scientist to stand up and say it's reasonable. Obviously, we're talking about Dominic Cummings and the idea that he didn't break the rules and that people, as we go forward, should follow the example of Dominic Cummings. That's what Boris Johnson is telling us. He cannot get a single scientist to say that, which is why they're getting pushed to the side. And we'll go to a very extreme example of this in a moment. But first, I want to take a look at the Minister for Care, Helen Whately, on last night's Question Time, giving a monologue about how people should respond to the track and trace system, which I can't imagine anyone with an A-level in chemistry, biology, or even any kind of social science would think was a reasonable response. Let's go to that.
What we've seen so far is people really sort of consciously following the guidance, and in fact, the guidance has included recognising that some situations will be more difficult. For instance, if you're looking after somebody who's particularly vulnerable, you have a childcare situation.
So if you have a childcare situation, then Helen, since you mentioned it, if you have a problem with childcare, and you have to be one of the people who's identified as someone who has to stay at home for 2 weeks, you may not necessarily have to stay home.
Well, you clearly have to make sure that your child is safe, as any parent should do so. But for instance,
so if you have to leave home to do that, even if you've been told to self-isolate, you can do that.
Well, if you're contacted because you're a contact of somebody who's got symptoms and told to isolate at home, you should be able to do so with your child. Now, everyone will have had their scenarios, but I mean,
no. But just to be clear, because it's important, because we're all going to have to adjust to this now, this new system. So if you are told to self-isolate at home for 2 weeks, either because you have symptoms or you've been in close contact with someone who has symptoms, but you have problems with that, you find that difficult because of childcare issues, you can behave otherwise. You don't have to self-isolate at home.
You should follow the guidance, but I don't think anyone should suggest that you should have a child in an unsafe situation.
So follow the guidance unless you can't.
No, that's not what I'm saying actually at all. You should follow the guidance, and that's been the case all the way through. People should follow the guidance. But what you're saying is,
you're saying unless.
But the guidance has always said that safety would be a factor, and you should be clearly a responsible parent. But I mean, I think what's really important is that people follow the guidance, and through doing that, that's how we manage to keep the infection rate under control, and so life can get back to normal or closer to normal, which would be so much better for everybody.
What has the defence of Dominic Cummings reduced these people to? It's so clear, this test and trace system that we're going to have, it's really important that if you have been in contact with someone who has coronavirus, who's tested positive for coronavirus, you stay in your house for 14 days. Now, if there's a question, what do I do if I have a young child? You stay in your house for 14 days, right? What do I do if I can't get access to any food? You ask a neighbor, you ask a friend. And if not, the government should be there saying, look, if they're really struggling, they should call the local authority or whatever. They don't say, if it gets difficult, you're allowed to leave. Because if you tell people as soon as it's difficult, you get to leave, then people are going to leave, right? So you have a government who is standing there explaining a test and trace system, which should be simple. It's if you get called and you get told to stay at home, stay at home. There might be a sort of 1 in 1,000 exceptional moment where, it's possibly justified to leave. Like your house is on fire, there's someone outside who looks like they're in increased danger, or maybe, you're in a house where you're a victim of domestic violence, really, really extreme situations. But so long as they can't deny or can't say, look, if you get told to self-isolate and you have some childcare problems, that's not a good enough reason to leave your home. But she can't say that, and she's just tied up in knots. And it is the most, it's just embarrassing watching that, isn't it?
Do you think she is tied up in knots, or that she's just stupid?
I think she's tied up in knots because, I don't
know. I've never seen her before on television. I'm not being rude or facetious. It's a genuine question. Well, she would have been briefed on this, from head to toe. And like you say, she was still absolutely appalling. So,
well, she was briefed on it, but all they can do is filibuster. You look at Michael Gove, who, we might think many things about him, but he's clearly an intelligent man, right? Same with Dominic Cummings, actually, clearly an intelligent person. They went out in front of the media trying to defend what Dominic Cummings had done and explain why it was within the rules. And they sounded ridiculous because it is ridiculous. I think this position which they've been sent out with, no one has been able to pull it off because it's so clearly ridiculous. And basically what she was doing there was filibustering for time over sort of 2 minutes, whereby, until they had to pass on the question to somewhere else, to the point where she was saying, oh, and it would be really nice if everyone follows it, completely changing the subjects at the end. And it just makes a mockery of this whole strategy. And I think the fact that you haven't had sort of some of the top scientists saying this is a joke, we won't stand for this, is a bit embarrassing for them.
But you know,
I mean, so many professional reputations are being trashed here.
We haven't talked about this much, but Dominic Cummings, his rationale and how he responded to the breakdown of his breaking of lockdown, his breaking of the rules. It couldn't be more Tory. He left his Islington home because between him and his wife, looking after one 4-year-old child was too much. He went to his second home in Durham. And of course, yes, he was seen walking in woods, but they were a private Bluebell wood belonging to his father. I mean, it's just great. Yeah, I escaped to my second home and was seen in my father's private wood. I just, it's sad that we don't, back in the day, in the Corbyn days with the old shadow cabinet, we would have had members of the shadow cabinet like Dawn Butler or somebody would go on television and actually say that. This is, the kind of the levels of comedy in terms of the people who are now directing the country is absurd. But sadly, that's left to the imagination rather than being explicitly said by senior politicians.
Well, that was the defense, wasn't it? It was saying, yes, I was walking in a wood, but my dad owned it, so it was fine. It's a very, very relatable excuse there.
Sorry, go on. It's just, I find the whole thing, his wife as well, nobody is mentioning his wife going to hospital with coronavirus. I mean,
I know that should be the main point. I don't know why people aren't focusing on that, because people are focusing. I mean, the memorable thing is this idea that he drove to test his eyes, which is ridiculous. But actually, the more outrageous thing is that his wife went to hospital.
Yeah,
in a part of the country with low levels of COVID-19.
Yeah. You went to Durham because you couldn't look after your child, and you had relatives who could do that. Hold on, you've driven 260 miles up there. Your sister lives there. Your nieces live there. Your parents live there. Why couldn't they take the child to the hospital? The child went with an ambulance. The mum went. Why couldn't one of them go with the kid instead? If you suspect she's got coronavirus, that absolutely should not be happening. This is I can't think of a means by which to diffuse this condition more efficiently than sending a sick parent and child to a hospital in a low infection area, which is exactly what you did. I mean, they did 4 or 5 things. These should all be sacking offences. Crazy. And this is, again, it's about the establishment and blue bloods. Mary Wakefield. I mean, people have probably seen her father, that clip of him yesterday going around on Twitter. Just insane, crazy social Darwinism. She has the temerity not just to think, oh, I got away with it. She writes about it in The Spectator twice. She goes
and then reads it out on Radio 4 as well. She read out that article on Radio 4, and they haven't had to, do a correction. Emily Maitlis got taken off air, but Mary Wakefield got to read live on Radio 4 a complete, an article which was a lie about her self-isolation while she was actually, gallivanting around Durham.
Going to Barnard Castle for her birthday. Anyway.
I want to take us back to Monday. On that show, we mentioned that after Dominic Cummings' sort of bizarre explanation of his experience in Durham, after that, the Prime Minister had a press conference, and we were expecting Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty to speak at that. That's what journalists have been told. They were there in Downing Street to do that. Then we saw them scuttling away at about, I think it was about 5:30, and we ended up with someone else up on stage. I think it was Yvette Doyle, and it was suggested at the time, it was speculated that potentially the reason they didn't have those 2 top scientists up there was because Boris Johnson didn't want them to get asked about Dominic Cummings and give an answer which he didn't like. Now, the first time we saw those 2 back up on stage was yesterday, and basically that confirmed all of our suspicions. Let's take a look.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Durham police have said this afternoon they would have sent Dominic Cummings home if they'd found him in Barnard Castle. If one of your most senior team wasn't paying proper attention to the rules, why should anyone else? And to the doctors, if I may, is that the kind of example that you want people to follow?
Well, Laura, first of all, can I say I've said quite a lot on this matter already, and what I also noticed that the Durham police said was that they were going to take no action and that the matter was closed, and I intend to draw a line under the matter, as I said, I think yesterday to the Parliamentary Liaison Committee. They're not taking any action, and I intend to draw a line under it. And all I can say, I know that you've asked Chris and Patrick, but I'm going to interpose myself, if I may, and protect them from what I think would be an unfair and unnecessary attempt to ask a political question. It's very, very important that our medical officers and scientific advisors do not get dragged into what I think most people will recognise is fundamentally a political argument. And if that's all right, Laura, And could we go now to Robert Peston of ITV?
So you saw that. I mean, I don't know if you watched that live, but it was absolutely, it was such a moment. Him standing there and saying, no, you cannot ask them that question, and then not allowing Laura Kuenssberg a follow-up. She was basically muted. He went straight to Peston. Robert Peston actually asked a similar question. He was like, I don't think it is that political, because it's a scientific necessity that people get a clear message about what they should do if they have symptoms of coronavirus. And so the scientists should be able to give an opinion on that. Boris Johnson then interposed himself in his language again. You ended up with Sam Coates from Sky sort of saying that to the two scientists, are you fine with Boris Johnson gagging you on this? Wink if you have problems with it. He went to them. They said, to be honest, we don't want to get involved in this either. But I mean, I think obviously completely shameful for Boris Johnson. I also think for those two, I mean, they should have the guts to say, it's not political to comment on whether it's appropriate to drive from a part of the country with high levels of COVID, London at that point in time, to a part of the country with low levels of COVID, Durham at that point in time, when you have symptoms. And the reason is because you will burden hospitals in rural areas and seed coronavirus from places with high levels of the disease to places with low levels of the disease. And if we do have many people doing this, if they've been texted to say you have to self-isolate for 14 days, it's also worth noting that it doesn't seem like there's any financial package that's been attached to that. You're just supposed to. So, Dominic Cummings didn't want to self-isolate in his 4-story house with his great income. Some people are going to be asked to self-isolate for 14 days without symptoms, without any extra money, in their little flats. It's the idea that you can have a strong public health message without condemning what Dominic Cummings has done. This isn't about resignations. This is about when it's raining, saying it's raining. And I think if you've got scientists who are unwilling to say that because they feel that would, I suppose, undermine their boss fundamentally in this situation, that the whole thing just becomes a complete joke. Aaron, I know you watched that live because we were WhatsApping at the time. What did you think?
I mean, my jaw literally dropped. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I could not believe the Prime Minister was stopping, not just, it wasn't Sienna from Labour List. It wasn't Michael Walker from Novara Media. This was Robert Peston and Laura Kuenssberg, two highly favourable journalists from broadcast media, not being given second sort of responses, which, about a month ago, a bit more than a month ago, that was established as protocol. They could get that, a follow-up. It was remarkable. And I agree with you. I think the response actually from Valence and Whitty, it was Valence and Whitty, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I thought it was deplorable. And they said, we don't want to get, like you say, involved in politics. It's not politics, it's public health. But what it illustrates to me is I have a sort of structural explanation for this, which is that because we don't have the formal separation of powers in this country, these people are political appointees. And ultimately, they see themselves as being dependent on the goodwill of the Prime Minister and the executive or the governing party, rather than, say, the legislature. And I think that's a problem. I think because you have so much power because of the British system in the person of the Prime Minister, in the cabinet, I think that makes this whole process very toxic. The idea of an apolitical, impartial technocrat, which is what the Chief Medical Officer is, we've had that role since the First World War. I think it's particularly problematic now in an era of polarized politics when you have a prime ministerial system. In the US, you've got the president. They would be answerable instead to Congress. I think it's much, much healthier. And so, yes, that's not good enough. I think when the investigation comes, that's what I thought when I saw their response. When the investigation comes or the inquiry comes, you're really in deep shit because you've basically just said, I am absolving myself of any blame when you should have just done your job fundamentally and said, yes, it's not abiding by the rules. We recommend other people don't do it. You didn't need to slay the guy. You didn't need to say he has to resign. You just need to say people probably shouldn't do that. No, we would consider it, unwise, which is kind of what the Durham police did. We think he probably might have broke the rules. We would suggest people don't do it. They thought the trip to Barnard Castle was bad. The original trip wasn't, although, I presume they probably thought it was. They just don't want to create too much of a sort of political scene. They could have done that. They could have done it really easily. I think they were cowards for doing what they did. But I also have, like I said, that structural explanation.
Should he resign? Political question. Did he break the rules? Not a political question. We got one final story before we move to the Minneapolis protests. First of all, we've got 2,000 watching, 500 likes. Let's get that up to 1,000 while we're still live. Our government might deny their COVID response has been a disaster, but the rest of the world can see it. So we've discussed on this show before how foreign newspapers and TV stations, we actually showed a report from CNN where they're talking about how did Britain get it so wrong? And at that point, our press still had not woken up to the fact that Britain's coronavirus response was a disaster. But the bad reputation of Britain's coronavirus response is now being reflected in government policy. So this is about the Greek government. They've released information about where people will be able to travel from to holiday in Greece. So it's got a white list. Let's get up the quote from the Daily Mirror about the announcement they've made. So the government has said they will accept tourists from a list of 29 countries when international flights resume on June the 15th. The countries lucky enough to be able to go on holiday in Greece are Albania, Australia, Austria, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, Germany, Denmark, Switzerland, Estonia, Japan, Israel, China, Croatia, Cyprus, Latvia, Lebanon, Lithuania, Malta, Montenegro, New Zealand, Norway, South Korea, Hungary, Romania, Serbia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, and Finland. The list was compiled after a study of the epidemiological profile of the countries of origin of the tourists and after taking into account announcements from the European Aviation Safety Agency, as well as the relevant proposal of the Infectious Diseases Committee. So you've got there a country, the Greek government, they're saying we will allow people to holiday here if they're from a country that has managed to successfully suppress the coronavirus outbreak. Britain clearly hasn't. I mean, the country that stood out for me there as well was China, because this disease emerged in China. They didn't have any warning. You know, there was a whole city that had to be locked down because of it. We initially thought of coronavirus as a problem that pertained to China, right? And now they're allowed to travel to Greece. And Britain, with months' warning, British people are too dangerous now to leave this country. And it's also a bit ironic because it's at this point in time where the government now have started quarantining people when they come in and out of the country, something which would have made sense about 3 months ago. But now it almost seems like they're doing that to sort of preempt the embarrassment of people banning us from going elsewhere, right? So if we make travel difficult, then it's less embarrassing when people say we can't travel there, because Britain at the moment has one of the highest levels of coronavirus in the world. So whilst when we had lower levels of coronavirus back in February, it would have made sense to quarantine people. Now it doesn't really make any sense at all. It's British people that are the risk now. Aaron.
We're going to have to get used to this, Michael. We are going to, as Brits, we're going to have to get used to decline. There's no other word for it. This is going to happen more and more and more and more. You know, it's been happening since 2008. It's really since 2016. It's just gone into warp speed. The quality of our elected officials now, the quality of our government is appalling. Actually, the quality of the political class generally, I'd apply that to Labour as well, is just terrible. You know, you look at some of the politicians even 20, 30 years ago on both sides of the sort of political divide, and they were just much more capable, competent, charismatic people. I don't quite know what's happened. And the quality of political decision-making is terrible as well. The quality of public debate is not particularly good. And I think we're just going to have to get used to this. This is the overhead. You know, in the next 10, 20 years, people will be going to the Netherlands, to Germany, France. And these countries have their own problems, by the way. France has its own problems. And they'll increasingly discern a lower standard of living here than over there, which is something that Brits, we went through that in the 70s, right? But we're going to go through it again. And this is just a kind of premonition of that, of, you know, Brits not being allowed into a country to go on holiday while people from China and Albania can. Get used to it, because the quality of our political decision-making will be increasingly terrible.
We've got another birthday. Luke Rogers with 15 quid. Hi, I'm a massive fan of the show. Today's my 20th birthday, and I know it's less political, but if you could give me a shout out, I'd be super grateful. Tysky Sour is the best birthday present. Solidarity. Happy birthday, Luke Rogers. I like this. It's like we've got a new tradition of I've never done a birthday shout out on the show, and now I've done two in one episode. I like it. We're going to go to our final story. So a really shocking and I think unprecedented moment, actually, when came out, it was widely shared on Twitter today. It was footage of a CNN reporter being arrested live on air while he was reporting. So this was in the context of the Minneapolis protests, which are protesting the killing, brutal killing, actually, of George Floyd. But first, let's go to this video before discussing the broader context. Let's take a look.
Wherever you'd want us, we will go. We were just getting out of your way when you were advancing through the intersection. So just let us know, and we got you. And this is a scene here playing out in Minneapolis. This is part of the advanced police presence that we saw come over the course of really minutes when the local police showed up at the fire department, or with the fire department, I should say, on that building we showed you that was burning. This is among the State Patrol unit that was advancing up the street, saying and scattering the protesters at that point for people to clear the area. And so we walked away. I'm sorry?
You're under arrest.
Okay. Do you mind telling me why I'm under arrest, sir? Why am I under arrest, sir?
Officer's with CNN and he's on the air right now.
Okay.
You are arresting him live on CNN. We told you before that we are with CNN.
If you're just tuning in, you are watching our correspondent, Omar Jimenez, being arrested by state police in Minnesota. We're not sure why our correspondent is being arrested.
Hang on 1 second, Allison. Let's listen into what these officers are saying.
So the officers ended up arresting the whole crew. So there was a cameraman, a producer, and the host. They said it was because they were sort of in their way, and they released them when they got proof that they were journalists. But I mean, they were clearly filming for CNN. The guy had his press pass out. I mean, it was completely bizarre, like an incredible piece of footage. I don't know what the police were doing. I'd have thought it was sort of like the 101 rule of policing, and this is for the cynical level. You know, you can arrest people arbitrarily, but it's going to be really bad for your reputation if you arrest someone live who is a host of a mainstream news platform. Obviously, it's just as immoral to arrest people who aren't news reporters for doing nothing, but arresting a news reporter for doing nothing while they're broadcasting live to the American public seems completely bizarre to me. But we should talk about, the context here. And to talk about that context, I'm joined by Tia Oso, human rights activist, speaking to us from Los Angeles. We are obviously seeing, enormous protests, days of it now, which is because of the killing of George Floyd, who's a 46-year-old African-American man by a white police officer. So it's filmed by a bystander. Another one of these situations where potentially, if we do get justice, it will be because someone happened to be filming it.
Right.
I think he had his. The police officer was kneeling on his neck for about 8 minutes, and there's a really awful video. It's been widely shared on social media, where you can see him saying, "George Floyd, I can't breathe," which is exactly the same words which Eric Garner said back in 2014, which would have launched the Black Lives Matter movement. Black Lives Matter movement. So I suppose, can I ask, by just getting you to talk a bit about the context, what happened on Monday, what's happened since?
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Michael, for having me on. So on Monday, George Floyd was detained by police and summarily strangled to death. On camera in the video that's been shared widely, you see just one officer, Officer Chauvin, kneeling down on his neck again while he's gasping for air, saying that he can't breathe, as well as the crowd of onlookers there, a few dozen onlookers, from what I understand, are also calling for them to leave him alone, let him go, get off of his neck, and has really traumatized the community and murdered this man. And there's been subsequent other angles that have been released where you see other officers also assisting Officer Chauvin and holding Mr. Floyd down. And Mr. Floyd's family, as well as community and friends, have been joined by the people of Minneapolis and the national and international, I dare say, community in calling for Officer Chauvin and the 4 other officers to be charged. They were fired by the mayor of Minneapolis on Tuesday, and just today, Officer Chauvin has been charged with 3rd-degree murder.
And that charge, 3rd-degree murder, how serious is that, and how rare is that? I mean, obviously, this guy could still get off after he's been charged, but is it unusual for an officer to get charged for this kind of thing? Is that already, I mean, in a way, an achievement of the movement, that this police officer is at least being charged? We don't yet know if he'll get found guilty.
Yeah, I do think that it's definitely rare that the police officer has been charged, especially past a manslaughter charge. 3rd-degree murder is not the highest and most serious charge. Usually, it depends on the state statutes, but murder in the 1st degree would be the most severe charge. So it's high up, but not the most severe charge that he could be charged with. And definitely rare, especially in the case where an African American person has been killed by a white police officer. It's very rare for charges to be brought against an officer, and usually they're found to have used force justifiably is the term that's usually used.
And let's talk about those protests now, and I mean, especially the policing of them. I mean, and especially that video we just watched.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
for me,
Egregious.
not even on a moral level. It's just, why would you? How out of control does a police force have to be to arrest live on television a CNN host? You know, it's not like some local internet. It's not like a Novara media reporter there. It's someone from CNN, and they arrest it. What were they thinking? What's going on there?
Well, even if it wasn't of our media reporter, we have protections for the media in our Constitution in the United States. And so people who are reporting are supposed to be free from repression by the state. And what you saw was the state, violently repressing these journalists who had, had their credentials and were covering the protests. It's been a few days of protests that have definitely been increasing and escalating. And CNN is a major news network that covers all different sorts of news. Definitely known for covering protests and uprisings, and to see the reporter arrested live on air. Other reports from the ground say that he was arrested first because he's Black, and then they just subsequently arrested the rest of the media. And you also have to understand, in the context of what's happening within the United States, this is also a media network that has been attacked by the president and called fake news, and a lot of dissent and foment has been engendered against the mainstream media in the United States as well by the president.
Let's talk about President Trump. We might be able to get it up. So he was it made global news today that he tweeted something which got hidden by Twitter, and now President Trump is at war with Twitter. Potentially not the most important thing going on today, but the tweet, he said, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts." Like a really brutal, aggressive, sort of inciting violence kind of tweet. And I suppose the broader question here is how much difference does it make that you have someone like President Trump in office at this period of time? Does it make it a more dangerous situation for people who are protesting against police violence? Does it give police more license to be more violent towards Black people in America?
Yeah, I would say that it definitely gives more credence, especially to violence by police. Under President Obama's administration, it's not as though the police were nice or friendly or prevented any type of, they did harass and kind of curtail the media when covering protests, because they want to protect their narrative. And so there are certain things that they don't want the media to see or to film. But under this president, he's an autocrat. It's totalitarian. These are draconian measures to attack the free press, as well as to call for violence, deadly violence against civilians who are exercising our right to protest as well, and exercising our right to resist. And also, death is not the penalty for shoplifting, if you want to call what's happening a crime. And so it is really dangerous, and it is a nuance that I think that is very important for us to understand about the right to free speech, the right to protest, the right to peacefully assemble, when you have the highest office in the land calling for people to be shot for looting.
Yeah, I want to talk about the various sort of repertoires of protest which we're seeing in Minneapolis at the moment, because obviously, in the mainstream media, there's a moral argument which is saying these looters are just as bad as the cops who are killing people by kneeling on their necks. And obviously, I don't think our audience have any time for that. But there is a sort of interesting question about strategy, and I have seen, from my quite removed place in London, sort of debates about whether or not looting and burning stuff is that a necessary way to get people's voice heard and to sort of create costs for police killing unarmed Black people, or is it a practice which sort of alienates certain people who could be allies? And I suppose connected to this is sort of lots of conversations and discussion about whether there are agent provocateurs who are sort of being inserted into these protests purely to make them seem more violent to outsiders.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question and discussion, and a very popular quote about riots by Martin Luther King is that riots are the language of the unheard. I think that rioting and looting are going to happen. They happen when there's a lot of pain, when there's a lot of tension, when people feel like they've been pushed to their breaking point, such as seeing, a fellow person, human beings, life taken from them by the police. I think that as far as strategy is concerned, there's nonviolent direct action, there's advocacy where, you write a petition or you call your legislator or the powers that be and call on them to do what is right. There's a whole philosophy around nonviolent direct action where you're putting your literal body on the line in order to create attention and to show the state as violent. I think that all of the different types of strategies and tactics have their place. And in organizing, as a community organizer, it's important for different people to have an opportunity to let their voice be heard in different ways. I do think, though, that in uprising and rebellion, when there is an environment that is so tense and people are so on edge that all different types of things happen, and there are oftentimes agents and actors that are not a part of the movement and not necessarily a part of any type of organized faction that can probably be taking advantage of the atmosphere. And then there's also, quite honestly, and we've seen this, in the Black Power movements of the 60s, there's COINTELPRO, where actual agents of the state will position themselves and commit violent acts in order to incite violence and also in order to make uprisings look more violent or more chaotic to outside observers. I've seen all of these things happen.
I'm just going to bring in Aaron.
Since 2013, there's been an intensification of disenfranchising African-American voters. And for me, the sort of the best argument or the sort of best excuse for the riots are, well, if increasingly people are being locked out of the full democratic process, what do you expect? But in the longer term, if you look at the things that have been going on in terms of disenfranchisement, hitting early voting, scrubbing people off electoral rolls and so on, it feels like, African Americans are being disenfranchised in a way that we've really not seen since before 1965. That seems to be the end goal for the Republican right. And so I guess my question is, in the longer term, what's the strategy there? You do have a liberal democracy in the US, but African Americans are being, essentially locked out. There's an argument that in the last election, a Democrat would have won rather than a Republican had there not been that level of disenfranchisement. Not to say that Clinton would have been, significantly better. Right. But I'm wondering, what's the interface between social movements and electoral politics, given these changes and given the very powerful interest trying to disqualify Black people from exercising their right to vote?
Yeah, Aaron, that's a really good question. And I think that it's important for us to understand that for people of African descent in the United States, our citizenship is in provisional status, is what I'll call it. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was not reauthorized in 2015 by the United States Supreme Court. And after the Voting Rights Act was gutted the way that it was by the Supreme Court, immediately we saw states begin to push for the exact type of measures that you're talking about. So purging voter rolls, really creating really egregious voter ID requirements. And for people who don't understand, we don't have a national ID or even a state ID that's automatically issued or distributed to people, especially if they happen to not be white, especially if they happen to not be of a certain social economic status, if they happen to be an Indigenous American person, all these different types of things. And so these ways that they're trying to push back on people's ability to franchise is directly correlated and related to the fact that the United States of America, demographic-wise, is getting younger and browner. And also, in the case of African Americans, some of the most reliable Democratic voters happen to be African American women, followed by African American men. So if at any point in time they can shave off, even if it's just a few hundred or thousand votes, be it through direct repression or be it through disinformation and misinformation and propaganda campaigns, they're going to do what they can in order to hold onto their control.
I mean, I just want to clarify. I saw an amazing statistic in North Carolina, which voted not historically sort of Democrat leaning, voted Obama in 2008, 2012. The turnout of African-American men between 2000 and 2012 went up 51%. And so if you're a Republican in one of these places, you think, Jesus Christ, these people are playing by the rules.
Right.
They're playing like, this isn't violent. This is the opposite of violent protest. This is peaceful, exercise of electoral suffrage. You don't get more, traditional politics than that. And then in response, they try and lock these people out of the electoral system. And you think, well, what do you expect? Anyway, that was just my 51% increase. And then the response is to disenfranchise fellow citizens.
Yes, because you have to agree that Black people are citizens. You have to agree that America is supposed to be a democracy. And since Black people won our freedom, we've been fighting for the franchise, fighting to be full participants in the democracy that the United States claims itself to be. And we have seen violent repression of that since that very day.
I've got a final question, which is, I suppose, about the achievements of Black Lives Matter, or what has changed between 2014 and now. Because obviously, I think most people watching that video, what will have really stood out is the man saying, "I can't breathe," which is what Eric Garner said back in 2014, which sort of launched the Black Lives Matter movement. And then 6 years later, you've got someone being killed in a very similar way, saying exactly the same thing. And it seems like a sort of appropriate time to ask, what has changed since 2014? What do you think the Black Lives Matter movement has achieved between now and then, which means that this moment is different now than if it had happened back then?
Mm-hmm. So the most significant difference that I can share is that in 2014 or 2015, Officer Chauvin probably would have been placed on administrative leave following what took place on Monday. Daniel Pantaleo, the officer who strangled Eric Garner to death, was placed on administrative leave and was still employed by the New York Police Department until very recently. So the fact that Officer Chauvin and the other 3 officers were fired immediately by the mayor of Minneapolis is the kind of measurable difference that you could say has taken place because of the success of ground building in human rights activism, under the Black Lives Matter banner, under police accountability banner. It's a nuance. People are more aware, and the policies and practices in a lot of different municipalities have shifted just a little bit, but it is just a little, because they still, police officers are still authorized to use lethal force to varying degrees in different cities and states. And so we are still seeing continually police killings, even though statistics may be going down in certain areas as to the how many instances of police violence we're seeing and police killings that we're seeing. The other thing that hasn't happened is our investment in policing. Cities are overwhelmingly investing their municipal budgets and their tax dollars into policing. Police are used to address things like domestic violence and mental health issues with really deadly consequences. And so that has not changed at all because of our societal reliance on violent police repression in order to maintain the status quo and really to control communities in the United States.
Tia Oso, thank you so much for your time this evening. That was a really interesting conversation to hear what's going on in Minneapolis right now, and obviously we'll keep a close eye on it. So thank you for your time and good evening.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Aaron.
Bye.
Super interesting. I mean, it does, like, the level of, obviously, I mean, we should talk soon on this show. Actually, we've talked about the unequal effects of coronavirus in terms of who it hits, who the disease hits, who the virus hits, and who is most likely to get killed from it. We talked about that with Sonia Adesara, partly because of what jobs people work in, partly because of I suppose how many people live in a household. That's got a lot to do with economic deprivation, but also Sonia Adesara was saying it's in part because of the fact that Black people, their pain is treated as less important than white people's pain. So there's many studies in hospitals that have shown that. But also, I think what's becoming more and more apparent is that also the policing of this lockdown is very much unequal in this country, depending on what race you are. So Black people are far more likely to get fined under the lockdown, what's the Coronavirus Act, and far more likely to be stopped and searched. There was a video that I saw you share, Aaron, today, of someone who was an ambulance driver getting stopped because he was just visiting his friend. The police officer said, "You haven't given me." The police officer stops him, says, "Why are you here?" He says, "I'm here to visit my friend." She says, "Oh, that's not really a good enough explanation, so I'm going to give you a drug search," right? And that is a good enough explanation. The Coronavirus Act lets you go and meet friends if you're outside. And that's what he was doing.
She says, are you from around here? Do you live here? He's like, yeah. And then she said, well, there's talk of, drugs being distributed in the area. Really? And during a lockdown? Really? I find that particularly hard to believe. I mean, she should be fired. We should talk about that.
Just a standard excuse, right? We'll do a proper.
Yeah, she should be fired. I just thought, again, it goes back to your point about arresting a CNN reporter. It's just take away the morality. These are obviously, you shouldn't do this. It's appalling. You should, it's illegal. But also just she didn't seem to be in receipt of just basic facts as a police officer. Now, often police officers bluff their way through it because they overstep by exploiting ignorance of the person that they're dealing with. But he was incredibly polite to her, and he had a perfectly legitimate and calm answer to everything she said, and then he was arrested. I don't think anybody can watch that video and go, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I tweeted that and it's got 4,500 retweets and retweeted by other people. Normally you get some right-wing sort of idiot say, oh, well, you haven't seen the thing from before, or there's context, or he deserves it. I haven't seen a single comment like that. It's one of those very rare instances of open shut. Appalling. And of course, you say ambulance driver, oh, black man, but he's an ambulance driver. Of course, he shouldn't be arrested. If he was an ambulance driver, how do people then respond? What's the impression there? I mean, crazy. It's just
you shouldn't have to be an ambulance driver, right?
You shouldn't have to be a key worker. Oh yeah, he's saving people's lives. Yeah, we won't now arbitrarily arrest you for no reason. You happen to be saving people's lives. I mean, come on, it's an outrage. But it's amazing. It's amazing to watch. That the levels of racism are astonishing. And there was a great quote by Will Smith. He said, "There's not more racism now; it's just getting filmed." And there's we can talk about the digital era and the very many downsides. But I think ever since 2014, arguably before, in terms of police violence against African Americans, it's really lifted the veil in a way that I think, in terms of a mass global audience, that just wasn't the case before.
I think we're going to leave it there. Aaron, always a pleasure. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your super chats tonight. If you do want to support us directly, you can go to novaramedia.com/support. Make sure you hit subscribe. Because we want to get our YouTube subscribers up to 100,000 by the end of the summer. And you'll also get notifications when we come back on Monday night at 8 p.m. Have a great weekend. Not just a good one. This has been Tiski Sour on Novara Media. Good night.